Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm Simon from Scholarstration, and I hope you're keeping well. Today I'm going to go through my process for a recent painting that I created for Monte Cook Games entitled Otherworldly Rider. Let's dive in. With this painting, I did something a little bit different. I didn't start completely from scratch. I had a pretty good color sketch that I created beforehand, so I included elements from that, such as the background sky and buildings. But the character itself was created from scratch. So for the character, I started off by creating a solid shape for the entire figure. And then I blocked in different areas within that shape with their local colors, such as the face, hat, coat, etc. Once I'd finished that, I added a new layer on top, and then added a quick mask, so that I could paint to the edges of the main shape without having to worry about being super careful. I could also quickly select the different areas on the base shape and work on those, which I find to be much faster and more precise. I started on the face, as I find that's always the hardest thing to get right. And my thinking is that once I get the face right, then everything else is going to be a lot easier, as I know that the most challenging part of the painting is behind me. After I finished the face, I moved on to the tail and added some basic details on there, before moving on to the character's jacket and the rest of the character's outfit. Once I'd added the shadow areas on the jacket, I started to indicate some of the mid-light tones. And once both of those were in, I then pushed their values so that the lights were lighter and the darks were darker. Once the jacket was more or less finished, I moved on to the character's pants, making sure to get all the folds correct from the get-go. After that, I moved on to the bullet belt. Now, the gun belt took a fair amount of time to get right, because each of those bullets is in a slightly different perspective as the belt goes around the character. As well as that, they each had a leather holder keeping them in place, and they had to all look like real bullets. Needless to say that there was a fair amount of decent reference needed for this, especially as I didn't have a gun belt that I could photograph myself. I then moved over to the belt buckle and rendered that out. Once that was done, I switched over to the gun and holster. Again, these two elements were pretty challenging. As you'll see, I painted both of these a few times to get them right. And in fact, I think I had to resize the gun, as it looked a little too small for the character. This is where doing studies of materials really comes in handy, because in this case, the reference that I had could only take me so far. And because I'd done those studies, I could fill in the gaps by adding in things from imagination to complete the rendering. Then it was on to the character's gloves and saddle, which was basically lots of leather work. Once the character was roughed in, it was time to move on to the horse. For the horse, I really wanted to accentuate that warm light and cool shadows, and I paid close attention to the horse's musculature for added realism. Instead of airbrushing in the different areas of the horse, I used directional brush marks, as I think they look a lot more interesting and realistic, and not so plastic. Once the horse's body was somewhat all in the right place, I moved on to the horse's mane. It took a few tries to get the movement and the shapes looking how I wanted them. After that, I moved on to the horse's reins. As you can see, they weren't super complicated. But saying that, you really have to get the details like this spot on, because if you don't, then they'll stand out like a sore thumb and look weird. There were lots of little metal details and stitching that I added as well. Then it was onto the saddlebag and the sleeping blanket on the back of the horse. Because the saddlebag is leather, I made sure that it looked as realistic as possible. I ended up painting the buckle on the saddlebag a few times, as I wasn't really happy with the way it looked. When I was painting all of these smaller details, I noticed that some of the horse's musculature was looking a bit off, so I went back and fixed those things. Then I worked on the horse's headpiece, and went back to finesse the horse's mane once again. When the horse was more or less done, I added a new layer and added some warm tones to the left side of the character and the horse, to really accentuate that firelight that the character was facing. After that, I went back to the character's hat, as the shape of the brim looked a little off to me. I also added some reflected colors to the underside of the brim, and to the underside of the character's tail. Then I moved on up to the cigar, and rendered that out, as well as adding some smoke. It's always the small details that seem to take a ridiculous amount of time, but it's always worth doing these things, so that everything fits together and looks cohesive. Zooming in and out a lot during the painting process. It's all very well to zoom right in, render something out, and think it looks great, only to find that once you zoom out, that it doesn't look quite right. So I try not to zoom in too much. For the cigar smoke, I made sure that I had good reference to work from, rather than making it up and for it to look too generic, which I can pretty much spot straight away. Flipping the character continually, so I can see if anything looks weird. Real quick, if you're enjoying the video, please consider liking and subscribing, as this will make it much easier for me to continue making this type of content. Now, back to the video. Then it was time to move on to the background. I didn't want to go too detailed on the buildings, because they're merely supportive elements and aren't the focal point of the painting. That being said, they still needed some attention. So I added some wear and tear to the saloon lettering, and to various elements of the building, such as the wood slats. The edges of the top of the building looked a bit too harsh or digital, so I softened those up. I then added some details in the windows to give the impression that there were people inside the rooms, and moved over to adding in some details to the shadow areas as well. I also went and checked the perspective of the building, with some perspective lines that I'd set up before I started painting. I added some glow to some of the windows, but not every window, as that would look too contrived and unrealistic. I made sure to not zoom in while I was painting the buildings, as I don't want to add in too many details that the viewer would then get stuck on. Finally, I added another layer on top and added some more orange tones to the wall of the building that was facing the fire. I then moved over onto the windmill on the left side of the painting and added some reflected lights. Once that was done, it was time to tackle the mid-ground flames. When I created the color sketch, I'd roughed in the flames just to indicate the basic shapes and placement. But now it was time to get in and start adding some more details. Once again, I didn't want to go crazy, as I want the viewer to look at the character and not spend too much time noticing the incidental details, as they're all there to simply support the character. I also added some sparks and glowing embers. Because this character is supposed to be otherworldly, I decided to add some blue smoke, which would offset the overall orange tones of the painting. Once I was more or less happy with that, I added some blue reflected lights to the character, so the blue smoke would feel like it was part of the painting, rather than looking like it was just slapped on there. I then added a subtle glow effect to the eyes of both the character and the horse, and then it was time to finesse the background clouds and smoke, which I'd largely ignored up until this point. I decided to add some subtle blue tones into the background smoke and clouds as a nice tie-in to the blue elements in the foreground. Hope this was helpful, and let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Please consider liking this video and subscribe to my channel. Have a good one, and keep on painting.